Hi everyone, my name is Mark Moykins from Big Mountain Studio, and this is the third video in a series where we are creating reusable pop-ups. And we've created the reusable pop-up, we've pulled it up from different view controllers, a couple of different ways, and then we're also passing in data to the pop-up to tell it whether to be a date pop-up or a select time pop-up. Now what we're going to do is when we click on this button where it says save time, we want this label to be populated, or when we click on the select date and save date, we want this label here to be populated. So I'm going to teach you 3 different ways to pass data back from the pop-up to this view controller that's opening it. And in this video, we're going to focus on one of the ways, and that is using notifications or the notification center. So let's get started. The first thing we want to do is go into our pop-up. And here's our button when we save the date or save the time. I called it save date because that's all we had at first, but now we have save time too. So that's what this action is here. And here we want to pass the data back of whatever date is selected or whatever time is selected. But when we populate the label, now the label, you set the property to a string. The label.text property is a string property. But we're going to get our date from a UI date picker, which just gives us a date object. So what we'll need to do is we'll need to take that date and format it for either a date in a string format or a time in a string format. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by creating a couple of properties here. One for the formatted date and one for the formatted time. Okay, we'll start with the formatted date. And it will be a string. That's what we want to return. And for the getter, what we need to do first is we need to create a date formatter object and tell it what format we want it to be. So you're going to learn a little bit about formatters here, date formatters. And this will be a date formatter. And then we have to tell it what format we want. So what we want to do is we want to set a date style for this. And you have a couple different choices for dates. The one we're going to go with is just the medium date. Okay, now what do we do with this formatter? Well, the formatter has a dot string function, and that's what we're going to use right here. So it returns a string representation of the given date formatted using the receiver's current settings. And the receiver is this formatter. And the setting is this setting right here, DateStyle equals medium. So we just have to pass in our date, and we get that from our date picker. And get it from the date property. Okay, so this formatted date will return a formatted time using a medium style in a string format. And that's exactly what we want. So we're going to create something like this for our formatted time too. Now here, it's going to be a little bit different because we're not going to use a date style, like this is what we had before, this date style. Instead, we're going to use a time style. And again, you have, like the same choices as before. Full, long, medium, none, short. For here, we're just going to go with a short time style. And on your own time, if you want to explore those different formats and what they look like, that's something that you can look up and check out. Okay, so there you go. They look pretty similar. The only thing that's really changing is just the style that we're using. One more thing I want to tell you a little bit about this property is it's going to be a read-only property. So we're not going to use a setter. We're not going to have a setter in here like this. So this is called a read-only property, but a little bit more, it's also called a computed property because there's 2 different types of properties. There's a stored property and a computed property. The stored property, we actually save this value in some kind of variable and it persists. But a computed property, we're actually getting the value from something else, from the date picker. So this is called a computed property. And just one more thing about these properties too, is this get right here, since it's a read-only computed property, we don't really need this getter. This is kind of optional. So what I could do something like this. I'm just formatting here. So this is totally valid. This will work, and this just automatically, this is the getter and it returns a value. So I'll leave it like this so you guys just know like the difference between the two. Again, when you don't need to have a setter and it's just a getter, then you can delete the getter. And so it looks like this. Okay, good. We have our two properties. So how are we going to notify the view controller that we are dismissing this pop-up and it can then access these properties to get the value that it needs? Well, we're going to use a notification center. So the way notification center works is it's kind of like a radio that's transmitting a radio station. And you have this radio station that's just transmitting its signal, and it won't do anything. It has no value or no use unless you have a radio that can receive it and listen to that radio signal. So that's sort of like how the notification center works. It sends out messages, but it has really no value unless someone is listening or observing those messages. So that's what we're going to do here is we're going to send out a message. And it's called post. We're going to be posting a message. And we're going to use this one here. So basically when you post a message, you have to give it a name, and that's kind of like your radio station, because whoever's listening has to tune into that same station or listen for that same name to get the notification. So we're going to post it using a notification name. And for the object, this is basically the sender, like who's sending it? What's the radio station's name? And for this case, it'll just be the pop-up, the view controller. So we have our notification name here. And then for the object property, you see it says any there. So it could be any type of view controller. I'm just going to say self, so we pass in this view controller that is sending it, which is our date pop-up view controller. Now for this name, it's a little bit different. It's actually, you can't use a string like this. Whoops. You can't use a string like this and say my name. That won't work, because what it's actually looking for is a particular type of string. Like this, an nsNotification.name, raw value, my name. So it's actually looking for a type of notification.name. So we can do it this way, but I normally don't like to do that because I want the notification name to be in one place, because there's a chance I could misspell it when I'm listening to it, when I create the observer. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new file here, and we're going to extend this notification name to include our own value. Let me show you how that's done. So I'll come here, new file. It's just going to be a Swift file. And I'll be extending the notification name. So I'll call this notification name extension. Okay, when you're creating an extension, you want to start off with the name extension. And then you tell it which class you want to extend. In this case, it will be notification.name. Okay, and basically what I'm doing is I'm taking this notification.name class and I'm adding a new property to it. And for the string value, I usually just use the same name as the property that I create. All right, awesome. Now notice what this allows me to do. If we go back here, we can get rid of this. So now what I can do is just type in notification.name. And there's my new property right here, save date time. Now what you can do is also just do this. Like I don't need this whole line here. I just do dot save date time, and it will have the value right there. It kind of shortens it up a little bit, saves you some line space. Okay, good. So now we're posting our notification, and we're letting anyone who's listening know that the pop-up is being closed, and we're passing in this view controller. So when we pass in this view controller, we'll be able to access all these properties that are on this view controller. And I'll show you how to do that. So let's go to our first view controller here. And in the Viewdidload, that's where we're going to set up our notification to observe or listen to that notification from our pop-up. There is something that has changed in Swift 4. There's a new way to do notifications. But let me show you the old way to kind of like orient you, because you might know how to do it the old way, and then I'll show you how to do it the new way. So basically what you want to do is you want to set up an observer. So you say notification center, default, and then you want to add an observer. Okay, for your observer, who's observing it is this class is going to be handling the observing. And for a selector, you type in selector, and then here you type in some function. So we'll say handle pop-up closing, like that. Okay, and what's the name we're listening to? Well, I'm just going to hit dot, and then I'm going to start typing in the notification name. It doesn't look like the autocomplete is working right now. And for object, we're not going to need this. We're just going to type in nil. Okay, and the autocomplete might not be working because it's going to give it error. Yeah, it's going to give it error on this function because this function doesn't exist yet. So let's just add this function here. And if you're using this way, what you'll need is this Objective-C function attribute. You need that if you're using this selector code right here. Okay, and the parameter, what it'll look for is notification as a type notification that you're passing in. So this notification parameter here represents the whole notification that it receives, which includes some information regarding the notification, including this value right here, this object value. And that's what we're going to use to get our value. Okay, so in here what you want to do is you want to get your date pop-up view controller from this notification. So what you do is you just create your variable here. We'll just call it date view controller. Then you want to access that parameter. You want to access the object property. This notification.object is this object parameter here. And of course what you're passing in is the date pop-up view controller. So you have to cast it as a date pop-up view controller. There we go. Now notice this is kind of like the same thing that we did down here. When you get the destination, this is a type of UI view controller, but we're going to cast it as a specific date pop-up view controller. So this object, it's a little bit different because this object isn't a UI view controller, it's actually an any, which can be any type. So we're going to cast it as a specific view controller. Now once you have that, then we can access our label and set the property. And I just realized we don't have an outlet for that label, so let's add that. We want an outlet for this label here. Okay, now that we have that outlet, let's go back. This is our date view controller, and we created two properties, the formatted date and time. So for this one, it's getting a date, so we want the formatted date. And there you go, that's the old way. Let's test it out, make sure it works. There we go. And that's the format. This is the medium format. It has the month, first 3 letters of the month spelled out, and the full year. Okay, good, so that's working. Now that's the old way to use notifications, observers. Let me show you the new way. I'll keep this here as reference, but I will comment it out. Okay, we want this one right here. And the way this one is different is instead of using a selector, what it's actually going to use is a completion handler or a block of code that you can pass into the notification center, and it will run this whenever it receives the notification. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Now notice here it's not asking the first parameter of who's handling it, so we skip that, but now it's just looking for a notification name. So I'm just going to hit dot and use our save date time notification.name that we created. Object, we're going to keep this as nil still. Okay, queue. Now this is what it's looking for here is what thread it should run it on. And if you've watched my other video on threads, you'll notice there's mainly 2 types of threads that you're interested in. There's the main thread, which handles all of the functions or all the rendering and computation that happens on the UI. And then there's the background thread. And there's many different types of background threads that you can use. But it's basically something that isn't happening on the UI. So what we're going to be affecting, what we're going to be handling is basically this code right here. We're setting the text on the label. And that, of course, is on the UI. So what we want to do is we want to set this to the main thread, which handles operations on the UI. What you could do, you could leave this nil, and by default what will happen is it'll use the same queue, the same thread that the notification was posted on. So if the notification is posted on the main thread, then it's going to use the main thread to execute your code. If the notification was posted on a background thread, then it's going to use a background thread, and if it tries to use a background thread and do some UI operations like setting text on a label, you'll probably get a runtime warning from Xcode saying, hey, you're not on the main thread, and you should be on the main thread. So we know we're coming from the main thread, but just to be safe, I'll just show you how to set it so we're on the main thread. There we go. And you see the description down here. Returns the operation queue associated with the main thread. And that's what we want. Okay, so I'm going to hit tab to highlight this last parameter, and then I'm just going to hit enter. And it's going to send us the notification object. That's what this parameter is right here. And I spelled it wrong. There we go, notification. So that is similar to this property right here. Or not similar, it is that property right there. That's the parameter that we're getting. So we can still use this. And actually what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this code and put it right in here. Except what it needs to know, it's not going to recognize this date label without the word self in front of it. And that should do it. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to comment this out too, since we don't need that. We want to make sure that's not running. And let me just add some comments here, because I'm going to make this code available to people who support me on Patreon. So this will be for them. This will be method number 1, and this is the old way. I'll just say notifications the old way. There we go. All right. So let's test this and make sure it still works. Yeah, still works perfectly. Okay, we're not done yet though. There is a problem that we're going to run into. So remember, we still have another view controller where we're going to select a date and set a label. So let's use this code, this new code, and let's add it to our second view controller. Yeah, let's format this. Let's get rid of some of this stuff that we don't need. Okay. Oh, you know, we don't have an outlet. Okay, let's add the outlet. Let's just go back. I'm going to copy this. Let's go forward. Let's paste that in there. But this outlet isn't hooked up, so we're going to kind of do it the reverse way here. This is another way you can set outlets. You just grab this plus right here, you click and drag it, and then you drop it on the label. So it's kind of the reverse. Before we just drag it from here to the code, and here we're dragging it from the code to the control to link them up. And if you want to see if they are truly linked up, you can always just right click and just say, oh, date label. Okay, we got it. Okay, now let's test this. Okay, good. Now I want you to pay attention here. We're on the first view controller, right? And when I select a date, this first one will be October. And it works fine. It says October, right? Now let's go to the second one, and let's set this to November. Everything looks like it's working fine, right? But let's go back and look at the first view controller. It says November. Now remember, we set that to October. So what's happening here? Why is this updating? Well, what is happening is we have two listeners. We have two observers and two different view controllers. And they're both listening for the same post. So as soon as I click on save date here, we have two view controllers, our first and our second. They're both listening. And what happens with, especially with a tab view controller like we have here, these view controllers are still in memory. So the Viewdidload ran for both of these view controllers, and it set up these observers. So basically we have two radios listening to the same radio station. And so what you need to do, or what we're going to do, I'm going to show you how to do this, is we need to get rid of these notifications. So we want to activate this notification when we're on the first view controller, but as soon as I click on the second one, we want to deactivate or remove the observer from the first view controller and then activate this view controller on this view controller. So whenever we leave a view controller, we want to remove all the observers, all the notification center observers. So how do you do that? Well, first of all, when you switch view controllers, there's an event that runs that happens after Viewdidload, and it's called ViewdidAppear. So this view controller is appearing. That's the function that we want to use. Whenever this view controller appears, we want to activate the notification center. So let's go back to our first view controller, and let's add a new override here. Oh, I'm still in caps lock here. Okay, and I'll also call the super here ViewdidAppear. Okay, so what we want to do is we basically want to grab this code. Actually, I'm just going to grab everything. And then we want to stick it in here. Yeah, like that. We don't need Viewdidload anymore, so I'm just going to remove that to kind of minimize the code we're looking at. Okay, so now every time the view appears, we're going to activate this notification center. But remember, we want to remove the notification center too, because if I just leave it like this is going to create a memory leak, because what's going to happen is it's going to add an observer the first time I come in here. I leave it. When I come back again, the ViewdidAppear runs every single time the view appears. And so it's going to add another notification center observer. Then it's going to add another observer and another one. So we have to remove it every time the view disappears. All right, we'll do that in here. So how do we remove the observer? Well, first we need a reference to the observer that we create. And if you look at this add observer here, it actually returns an NSObject protocol. Now, we're not doing anything with the protocol right now, but we're going to, since we have to remove it. So I'm just going to copy this, and I'm going to create a variable to hold on to this notification that gets returned. And I'll just call it observer. And I'm going to add the question mark because it's going to be optional. Okay, now that I have this observer variable, I can set it right here. Okay, now that I have a reference to my observer, I can actually remove it now. And since this is optional, I'm actually going to check to see if we have one first. And then if we have one, then I'm going to remove it. There we go. Okay, that should fix it. Now what we want to do is we want this code in our second view controller as well. And I'm just going to remove this. There we go. So again, when the view appears, we're going to set up a notification observer. Oh, we don't have a variable here. Let's add that. Okay, let's see if that works. There we go. Okay, so let's cover again what's happening here. Every time the view appears, it's going to add our notification observer. And when we navigate away from it, it's going to remove it. So essentially what we're doing is only the view controller that we can see is the one that's listening to events or listening to notifications. Okay, again, we'll select October just to test. We'll go to the second one and we'll just leave it on November. And if we go back, then the other one should still be October. There you go. So in this video, you learned how to use the notification center to send data from the pop-up back to the view controller that opened it. And I also showed you the problem where you can set up many observers for the same notification. So when a notification does post, all the observers receive it at the same time. So that's one of the things to know about the notification center, is you really have to keep track of which observers you set up and make sure you remove them when you don't need them anymore, or you don't want them listening to notifications. Okay, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video about the new updated notification center, give it a thumbs up, consider sharing it, and if you want to help out, you can add a translation in your native language to the title and the description of this video. And consider subscribing, because I have 3 more videos that are going to be coming out that will discuss 2 more ways to pass data back from the pop-up to the view controller, and then we're going to talk about memory leaks and how to find them and then how to fix them. All right, thanks guys.